Oh, anyway, hi. So I'm here with some really interesting people in Australia. I know that. Currumbin Beach, Australia. Australia's the easy part. It's the Currumbin Beach, which is...
You can't go anywhere without her. Look who's here. That's another interesting thing.
Hey, gosh. Come on in.
Thank you.
Actually, why don't I introduce everybody? Do you mind if I introduce you? Global audience. Maybe you could just like say a word. I'll just there you are. We're gonna pass around the peace computer.
Hi everyone. I don't know who I'm saying hello to, but I'm Richie. I'm South African. Been living in Australia for 25 years. So hi wherever you are.
And he was a professional tennis player
in the glory days. Yeah.
Okay. We're gonna actually have everyone introduce themselves because we always do these programs. But yeah, go ahead. Please don't drop the computers and I'll be forced to sue you. So,
hi everyone, my name is Krishna Gana. I'm just here to listen and learn. Very well.
Hare Krishna, my name is Henrika. I'm managing Krishna Village, which is a project that we have here on New Govardhana, Australia, and I'm looking after the business side of things there.
She's not a cutthroat captain.
Only sometimes, though. Depends on the mood of the day.
Yeah, my name's Lakshmi. I'm from Malay Island, and I'm a YTT student. And I invited myself here. Thank you.
No, you did.
That's good.
You were invited.
Hello, everybody out there. My name is Mohini Murthy Devidasi, and I am a multi-creative.
Where are you from?
I'm from Montreal originally.
Montreal.
Montreal, oui, je suis de Montréal. Originally.
Hello, everyone out there. How are you, beautiful people? My name's Rhiannon Rees. My philosophy is loving kindness, and I was drawn here by my heart and my soul, and I feel very blessed. Now I can actually say his name, Acharya. Enjoy.
We're just introducing ourselves.
Spell it.
But can you spell it?
Oh, right now?
Okay. Yeah, do you want to introduce yourself? Because there's people around the world, and do you want to end this live video? No, I accidentally hit that button. Sorry, this is Australia, so that's why we're all having a good time.
Hello everyone, my name's Yossi. Been living at Krishna Village for 2 years, and very excited to be on your live feed at the moment with the rest of the world, whoever's watching. Hello everyone. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, what they say? Hello, I'm Maria Lix. I'm from France, and
La France.
France, yeah.
France.
And I'm living in Krishna Village since 6 months now.
Ah oui, nous parlé.
Yes. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Bienvenue.
Thank you.
So, we have a global body, and so thank you everybody that's watching. Just keep putting coins in the meter, and I'll keep talking.
If we run out, we'll stop this. I'm sorry, I was just about to say the most important. Oh.
You and I are going to get on the radio.
Touch the screen. So I thought I would talk about something. Well, actually, I'll introduce it this way. I am within the Hare Krishna movement. So I actually joined a religious institution anyway. So somehow I'm in charge at the present time of Brazil, because I sort of opened up Latin America many, many years ago and published books and everything. And so recently they asked me to come back and just sort of oversee Brazil. Now, what's going on in Brazil right now is that there is a terrible political battle going on. And because oftentimes when there are extreme conditions, people become interested in extreme solutions. And probably the worst possible example, or the best example, is Nazi Germany. And I mean, there's the whole story of how sort of this very unwise peace treaty at the end of World War I, and Germany became desperate. It went from being the richest country in the world practically to one of the poorest. and those extreme conditions. In extreme conditions, people who otherwise would not seriously consider extreme solutions. So that's, I'm not saying they should go for those solutions, but they do. That's just human psychology. Like, for example, if you, let's say you have a little cold and the doctor says, I want to perform this heavy surgery. It's like, no, I think I'll just have a little cold. Yeah, but let's say, for example, God forbid, someone has something really serious like cancer, then you consider an extreme procedure because the problem is extreme. And so in Brazil, Brazil went through a few years where they're very prosperous. It looked like Brazil's going to join the family of sort of prosperous nations. And then it all crashed. And they went through severe, and they still are going through very serious economic problems. The history of Brazil is that actually when I first went there in 1974, because I was in charge of Latin America, they had a military dictatorship. There was a time when that was very common in Latin America. Like on any given day, you might wake up and find yourself living in a military dictatorship. And of course, some people will say, yeah, when there was military dictatorship, crime drastically reduced. Now Brazil's kind of overwhelmed with crime. And the economy, and there's obviously arguments on both sides, and there are many bad arguments and historically uninformed arguments on both sides. But suffice it to say that at this point, they're about to have a presidential election. I think it takes place today or tomorrow. And they expect a runoff because there's half the people in Brazil are sort of officially candidates. I'm just kidding. But there's a lot of candidates. And but the person who is in front, who is supposed to win the election, ultimately is a man, former military guy named Bolsonaro, who is flattered with the name of the Brazilian Trump. So now that you're all very sympathetic to this gentleman, but what's happened is the president before that, actually a few presidents before, 2 or 3, was Lula. Lula was socialist, and some people think he saved Brazil. Some people think he ruined Brazil. He's now in jail. Well, because he was convicted of corruption, of taking a bribe, which is a relatively small amount, considering that the president of Brazil deals with billions of dollars. He was convicted of accepting, I think, a sort of a luxury apartment or something somewhere in the Sao Paulo area. And so I certainly have no right or ability to comment on his guilt or innocence, so I won't.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
How does someone like a Donald Trump get into power and run?
We'll get to that.
Okay, good.
I just want to go step by step.
Sorry.
I forgive you, just kidding. So,
one strike against my name.
So, take her water away.
It happened already.
Oh no, I asked. So now I'm going to sort of work my way into the topic. This is not an age-related, does he know what he's talking about? So in Brazil, they're about to have a presidential election, and it is so, to use the typical journalistic language, hotly contested. It is so, the emotions, like in America, are so high. People, it's not just a question of people disagreeing politically, it's a question of people despising each other and thinking that the other side is going to destroy the world as we know it. It's kind of on that level. And so it has gone way beyond, could you close that? It's gone way beyond what you could call civil discourse or rational political debate. It's nothing like that. Now, the relevant thing for me, otherwise it would just be, okay, there's a problem in Brazil. It's not the first time, and there's problems everywhere. What makes it more relevant to me, in a sense, is that this battleground atmosphere has actually entered the Hare Krishna movement. So that, and what kind of the trigger was that a senior sannyasi, Swami, published online. Published nowadays means online. It used to mean you actually, like paper. Yeah. So he posted or published an essay, which apparently was quite conservative, and so it provoked a fierce negative reaction among certain devotees, and apparently this Swami, who of course I know very well, but this Swami, he was going to speak at a university in Brazil, and some of his remarks, which were taken to be, but anyway, I'm not accusing him or exonerating him, it's just sort of reporting. I'm just your reporter on the scene here. Homophobic, misogynistic. Of course, those aren't really serious issues. I mean, just kidding. So homophobic, misogynistic, and there was something else, I think. It was kind of this nice little
Throw in racist for good measure.
Yeah, this nice little cocktail of positions. So his program was canceled at the university.
Wow.
And probably most of the people that joined the Hare Krishna movement, at least in Brazil, and arguably in other places, I just don't know, but probably in Brazil, come from more of a left background than a right background. Because for one thing, if someone tends to be on the right, they tend to be conservative, which means they want to conserve traditional values. And Hare Krishna is not the traditional religion of Brazil. So it's almost like, it goes without saying that if you're a conservative in the literal sense, you want people to be Catholic in Brazil. That's the traditional religion of Brazil. And not even evangelical, because, South America traditionally was just Catholic. And there's been a huge growth of evangelic movements, Protestant movements, fueled by movements in America, which is everyone's favorite country. And so anyway, what's interesting is that at least in Brazil, Catholics tended to be, at least when I went to Brazil, I first went there in 1974. 44 years ago. So I was 5 years old. I was in charge of Brazil. Incredibly precocious. So I went there, and everybody's just Catholic. A few people weren't Catholic, but basically it was very much a Catholic country. But it was tolerant. It was like Brazil is a country that it's just very casual about that religion. People like spirituality. They like mystical things. There's a huge presence there of African mysticism, sort of, communicating with ghosts, Umbanda and Currumbin and different traditions there. So, even like a typical thing, someone will be a Catholic, a faithful Catholic, and also on Thursday do sort of African witchcraft. And so, that's Brazil. So it's kind of an eclectic place. And the people are just casual. Brazil, like the national motto, at least it used to be in Brazil, was like tudo bem, like it's all going, so everything's okay. Sort of, it's Brazil. They came up with samba. And if you listen to samba, that's kind of like the mood of the country. And, a lot of the very nice people, it's a beautiful country, a lot of really nice people, your neighbors in the Southern Hemisphere. But when the evangelicals came, American evangelicals are not famous for being eclectic and synchronistic and tolerant. It's just exactly the opposite. And so the entrance of the evangelicals in Brazil, which really disturbed a lot of people. A lot of people who otherwise are tolerant because of the fanatical tone and all that, people really didn't like it. Of course, a lot of people joined, still a majority Catholic country, but a lot of people don't like it because they feel that it was a peaceful country, it was a tolerant country, and now we have this fanaticism. Interestingly, as sort of a wannabe historian, it's in a sense what we're seeing in Brazil. It's like going back in time, because that's exactly how people responded to sort of fanatical Christianity in the Roman Empire. If you read, for example, Tacitus, who's one of the great Roman historians, and a really good historian. He's even considered today one of the great historians. And he really is disturbed about the entrance of what he perceives, correctly, as Middle Eastern fanaticism. So if you look at the Greco-Roman world, they had this sort of, by syncretistic, it means like, hey, we're worshiping the same God. I mean, you call him Zeus, or someone else calls him Jupiter, or you know, what Ahura Mazda in the Zoroastrian tradition, but same guy, or Yahweh in the Bible. So this goes back to the time of Alexander. I mean, Alexander had this one world program to unite everybody, like, let's all just be civilized and realize that we're all worshiping the same God in different ways. And so you have this old tradition, Western tradition, which actually was kind of revived, starting with the Renaissance and then the scientific revolution. And so we've come back, in a sense, culturally to our Greco-Roman roots. Because the mood we have today, which is, yeah, there's one, you know, supreme truth, which is actually, what do they call it? Prisca theologia. There's actually an old Latin term which literally means the ancient theology. The idea is there's really a single, ultimately divine reality, which different people perceive and express in different ways, but we're really all talking about what is ultimately an absolute truth. But I mean, through our various cultural filters, through our psychological filters, and whatever else, you know, we may approach it in different ways, but we're all really taught. But there is ultimately one truth. When we're all pure, we'll all see it together. And so that was very much the mood of the ancient world, classic Greco-Roman world, and we've come back to it, really. At least, you know, people could consider to be reasonable. We've really come back to our, and I mean this in a positive sense, and I don't mean any offense to any religion, our pagan roots. I mean, I like pagans, actually. I mean, if you study history and see who they really were, they were actually, I mean, not everyone, of course, but there were a lot of very powerful, distinguished philosophical traditions and spiritual traditions. It wasn't just a bunch of people doing like weird rituals and, you know, slaughtering animals in the forest at midnight, you know, naked with their bodies painted blue. And so, anyway, so the reaction in Brazil to this Protestantism, this fanatical, not Protestantism, but just the evangelical fanatical approach, it's kind of, for me as a historian, it's kind of like looking through time and seeing that's exactly how people felt 2,000 years ago.
And we're back there.
Yeah. And so, but that, I think that's kind of like a backstory. In other words, because this person, this person on the extreme right, and I want to talk about that also, the term extreme right. This person on the extreme right is an evangelical. And so already you can see how a lot of people are not going to be happy. And yet, in a sense, without judging, because, and you probably, you know, there's a lot you could say about this, but just in strictly neutrals or social science terms or historical terms, you'd have to say that, in a sense, the evangelicals, despite, you know, whatever hypocrisy there may be, and it's probably not a small amount, but they are at least externally, they're externally like really moralistic. We've got to get back, you know, family values and sexual mores and all that. And the Catholic Church was kind of relaxed. It was sort of like a typical unresponsive, sort of take it easy monopoly. I mean, monopolies tend to be unresponsive.
Because they can.
Yeah, exactly, because they can. And so anyway, getting back to Brazil, so there's this tension about, because he's an evangelical, so there's all these, he pushes these buttons because, number one, he's not Catholic. He's not like a true blue Aussie Brazilian. You know, he's Protestant. And also he had a military career. And up until, I don't know, maybe 30 years ago, 35 years ago, whatever the exact number is, Brazil was ruled by military dictatorship. So when you get someone who's now, of course, he's a civilian, but when you get someone who had a strong military career, and he's Protestant, evangelical, and he's going to the right, it's like, oh my God, the dictatorship being reincarnated. And so therefore, this has really provoked the left. And so Brazil has really descended into sort of open political warfare at a level which almost makes America look rational.
Wow.
One interesting observation with that is though how people who've lived under military dictatorship or dictatorship of kinds all around the world seem to kind of like something about it. Like look at the Russians, look at that.
Well, let's get to that. Yeah.
Simple people.
Well, that's a very good point.
I'm voting for it, which is
No. Well, because they're not just crazy. And so, I mean, some people value the right to walk down the street and not be murdered. I mean, some people see positive value in that. And so, but anyway, but it's a very good point. So we'll get to that. So anyway, so in the Hare Krishna movement in Brazil, it it's like one of those sci-fi movies. I like sci-fi. I think it's one of my favorite genres. But it's like one of those sci-fi movies where, oh my God, the extraterrestrial bug got inside of your hand is turning pink, and that means that you got it. So it's seeped into the Hare Krishna movement, and now there's this culture war going on among devotees. Not everyone, not most people, and certainly not officially. I mean, no one who actually has an official position in our blessed religious institution there. No one is actually, in fact, myself and Dhanvantari Swami, another sannyasi who works with me at a GVC level, I mean, we have to kind of calm this down. Like, actually, we're a spiritual movement, and our real goals are spiritual, and we don't want to jump into this zero-sum dogfight.
Yeah. Are you able to calm it down?
What?
Are you able?
Yeah. We've already started doing that. Because devotees ultimately, when you talk reason to them, almost all of them will be reasonable. But anyway, so it's not that the whole movement's in an uproar. It's just, it's a typical small minority that's active on the internet. But now, so here's what I want to talk about. So that's kind of background. So what it brings up is, how do you proceed rationally, not fanatically? And there's political fanaticism is just as prevalent as religious fanaticism. How do you proceed rationally to construct or preserve the best possible human society? It's kind of utilitarian ethics, so that to do the greatest possible good for human beings.
That's the question.
Yeah. And what does that look like? I mentioned the thing about extreme right because I'm going to say something which may sound controversial, but I didn't vote for Trump, and I would not vote for Trump because I think he's clinically cuckoo. But
surprise. I'm just kidding.
But I don't like mob psychology, and there's a lot of mob psychology going on both sides. And here's one fact. If you look at the press, which tends to be very liberal, there are a few notable exceptions like Fox News. But in general, if you look at, let's say, like France 24 or Deutsche Welle in Germany, or BBC, or the major American outlets, if you look at the major Western press, they definitely tilt to the left. And so you're getting your news filtered. I'll just give a couple examples. In Europe right now, there's the rise of these populist movements, right-wing movements. I mean, you find it in Sweden, it's growing like anything. In Germany, Alternative for Deutschland, they took over the government in Italy. The France, the Front National, the National Front in France came in second in the presidential election recently. They came in second, beating the other traditional parties. Holland, Denmark, Hungary, they control the government. The Czech Republic, they're winning.
They're screaming here also, the National
Australia.
Yeah. So what's going on? I mean, and so now I will give you a few facts. Like I said, I'm not an extreme right person by any means. I mean, my God, I'm Hare Krishna. I'm an oppressed minority. But here's some facts. In mainstream Western press, there virtually is no term extreme left. It doesn't.
But that's interesting in itself.
Very.
Like, why is there not?
Because they don't hesitate. I mean, extreme right they throw around very freely. Like basically anyone who is right of center is extreme right, and they use this a lot because extreme is a pejorative word. Now, here's just one interesting fact. that from the numbers I've been able to find by doing, I think, fair-minded research, the left, Marxism, communism, apparently killed about 5 times more people than Hitler in the 20th century. These are real numbers. Yeah, it's a number you'll never get from the press and you'll never get in liberal universities, but it's a real number. You look it up. So if you look at Stalin, who was, my God, I mean, do monsters exist? Yes. Stalin, Mao, who was insane, and tens of millions of people. I mean, it's just like we're almost afraid to count. You're almost afraid to do the body count in China. So if you look at Mao, if you look at Stalin, yeah, Khmer Rouge. I mean, killed like about 10% of the whole country.
Rwanda.
I mean, what's that?
Rwanda.
Well, that wasn't necessarily communist. But what I'm saying is that the number I got, and I looked it up. I was just trying to, and I looked it up. And the number I kept getting from different researches and different academic sources was about over 100 million, and Hitler killed about 20 million. I mean,
It's an insane number.
yeah, it's and yet, if you go to, and here, so I just want to put some facts out. Whenever you get people who live in an echo chamber, in other words, they surround themselves with people that all think and talk like themselves, you're going to get massive stupidity. Because it's precisely in the act of, it's, for example, when I was young, which is a very short time ago, and I remember when I went to the university, I went up to Berkeley, you know, and the whole idea of going to the university was you're going to be exposed to other points of view. You're going to have your own, maybe, you know, assumptions challenged. Perhaps your prejudices will be revealed, and you're going to have to defend your points of view, and you're going to become a rational human being.
That's not what happens.
It kind of, I mean, to some extent, imperfectly, it happened to me. I mean, to some extent. But in order for that to happen, you see, the magic word nowadays is diversity. You know, if you don't believe in diversity, you're more evil than the devil. But the point is, if you look at these universities, in their lust for racial diversity, ethnic diversity, the one thing they don't want, the one thing they've actually not cultivated, is the most important thing, which is viewpoint diversity. Because you can have a bunch of people from different races and ethnicities, but if they all think the same way,
There's no progress.
and the universities have been taken over by the left, as much as, and I really mean this, medieval universities were controlled by the church. I mean, the homogenization of thinking, the total like political, so that if you're not politically correct, people are afraid to speak because they will be socially abused. They'll be, I mean, they're really afraid to
I
speak.
think that's exactly what's happening in America. Like it's an homogenous with Trump and things.
Well, no, actually it's the opposite.
You think?
No, yeah. People, something very different is happening. I'll explain it. What happened, just to not keep you in suspense, the reason that strange living entity was elected is precisely as a reaction of all kinds of people who are not intellectuals, but who are tired of being bullied and shamed by the left. They just like, enough. They're not intellectuals. They're not like, all of them, and even a lot of intellectuals. So to get to the point here, for example, among psychology professors in the United States, the ratio of left to right is 17-1. It's like being a Muslim in a medieval European university. Like, don't even think about saying the word Allah. I mean, don't even think about saying it. So getting back to the, or if you, I mean, what I'm telling you now is based on serious social science. This is not coming from Fox News. This is serious social science, because there is actually a growing conservative intellectual revolt in the United States, which has nothing to do with Trump. I mean, it has nothing to do with him. Most of these scholars don't even like him. But it gets back to the monopoly thing, that when you have a monopoly, you don't really give a damn.
You don't have to.
And so basically the left, again, they monopolize academia. They monopolize it. So that if it's known that you have, let's say, conservative views, even if you hold your views rationally, even if you say, well, I've done my fact checking. You may not agree with me. To say that someone holds a rational position doesn't mean they're right. It just means that it's a thinking person that researched it and is giving reasons for what they're doing. It's not just they hate people that aren't like them. And so if you go to many, many, many Western universities now, you are indoctrinated as practically more than you're educated. And if you dare to hold conservative views, even if, again, you have good reasons for them, then you will be ostracized and even flunked. I mean, you are in danger at various levels. And so therefore you don't have an environment in which people can talk to each other. There's no more dialogue. We find now that, and again, I'm not defending all conservative values, but at any given moment, the problem is somewhere. And getting back to monopoly, there was a time when I went to college, actually,
Recently.
Very recently. When I went to Berkeley in the late 60s, which is a very short time ago. When I went to Berkeley in the late 60s, America in general was conservative. I mean, there were Democrats and Republicans, there were quote unquote liberals and conservatives, but what was called liberal back then would be practically conservative now. And there was what was called the generation gap, like kids couldn't agree with their parents. There was like culture war between children and their parents. Parents being more, my parents always voted Democrat. And yet, to us, they were like, oh my God, you totally don't get it. Yeah. Mark Twain said something funny. He said that when he was young, a young man, he left home because his parents didn't understand anything. And then he said, I went back several years later, and I was amazed at how much they learned in my absence. So anyway, so what you have now in Western universities is mind control. Indoctrination, not education. Western universities are not places of free speech. And I should add that, and again, I'm critiquing the left, not because I'm on the right wing, but just because I think it needs to be critiqued, because it hardly ever is. And if you want to understand Trump, you have to understand. Since you asked it, I'll explain it. There's a lot of people who actually believe in decency, who believe in certain conservative values, which, by the way, and by conservative values, I don't mean racism, I don't mean sexism, I don't mean any of those things, but just conservative moral values. And what's happening now is that on a massive scale, social science is confirming conservative views. To give one example, the sanctity of marriage, which, on the left, they think that's disgusting. It's undoubtedly a capitalist, white, male, chauvinist, plot to enslave people that aren't white and male, marriage. But actually, what social science is massively showing is that children who grow up in families where, there's a husband and wife and actually like each other, do much better. Children, of course, these are statistics, these are percentages. It doesn't mean everyone. You could take a kid from a broken home that has 100 times better life than a kid from
It's not the norm.
Yeah, but for the most part, kids who grow up in broken homes, much more likely to commit suicide, much more likely to be poor, more likely to become violent, and so on and so. And so what's interesting is that what's happening nowadays is that just on the right, some people on the right, but like the stupid right. I call it, there's the intellectual right and there's the stupid right. So on the stupid right, they are, including certain prominent politicians, they are science deniers. For example, that's why this, one of the things I think, Trump, it's like, what's the stupidest thing he did? God, that's a tough one. But I think for me, and amazingly, some things he's doing are actually are actually you could defend, although a lot of things you can't defend.
Look, I have a really weird picture of it. Like he's digging up all this dirt. That's how it feels. He digs up all this dirt.
But you see, you're getting Trump. And again, I think he's dangerous. I think I even when he was campaigning before he got elected, I could understand immediately this person is not mentally stable.
Correct.
So I never would have voted, no matter how conservative I am, because I will never vote for president for someone who I believe is mentally unstable. But apart from that, so you have this left monopoly. The left has monopolized the academy, basically. So if you look historically at the percentage of professors, college professors, who are left and right, it used to be, let's say when I was in school, maybe 2 to 1. So it was mostly left, but maybe 1/3 was conservative. So now it's something like, it's crazy. It's, I don't know what, 15 to 1 or 10 to 1. So it's, in other words, universities are no longer places of free speech. They're no longer places of open, free discourse. And that's why, and what you have to keep in mind is that the left, historically, has really never been in favor of free speech. You see, there's that false impression because, let's say in my experience, I was very much on the left when I was at Berkeley. I was in the streets, And because what our experience is, let's say from recent history, for some of you it's sort of, recent history. For me, it's something I went through. And that is, we have this image that you have conservative societies, dictatorships, and all like that. And then the left goes out, demands free speech, demands human rights. But actually, the real history is different. Because in general, anyone that doesn't have power wants free speech because they're not allowed to speak. So let's say, for example, you're against Putin in Russia. And there are a lot of people against Putin, especially educated people. And so you want free speech because you don't have it. Or even if staying in Russia for a moment, if you were, let's say, a free thinker under the Tsar, you wanted free speech. Or if so because you tend to get these right-wing dictatorships, and so there's this image, the left fighting for free speech. What's the real history? The real history is that practically whenever the extreme left, a term which no longer exists in the liberal media, because in the left, they're never bad. There's no extreme left. No matter how fascist they are, no matter how violent they are, it's never extreme left. They don't use that term. They only use the term extreme right. Look at Russia. I mean, the Tsar, I'm not saying let's go back to the glory days of the Tsar. But when the communists took power, they immediately started killing everybody that disagreed with them. Interestingly, one of the complaints against the Tsar was that it was just a very inefficient government. Like people were starving and they were just, enjoying all their opulence. But there was a tremendous amount of criticism of the Tsarist regime when the Tsar was in power. And of course, they executed some people, but there was a massive amount of criticism leading up to the Russian Bolshevik Revolution. And so when the Bolsheviks actually took power, the level of free speech dramatically dropped. Freedom of religion was destroyed. Freedom of speech was actually very seriously reduced compared to what it was under the Tsar. What happened when Mao took power? Freedom of religion, gone. Freedom of speech, gone. Freedom of assembly, gone. And so, Cambodia, so if you look, right now in America, and fortunately there's a huge backlash that's being beaten down, but the far left, a term which you'll never find in the liberal media, the far left was trying to violently stop speech. In other words, they were demanding that conservative speakers not be allowed to speak at a university. I mean, university is in the West was supposed to be the last refuge of free speech. No matter how crazy and stupid it gets outside, at least at a good university, people can still, defend what they think is reasonable, whatever that is. And so, it's interesting because if you look at the free speech movement in Berkeley, which started the whole Berkeley Revolution, it was a conservative society, conservative university administration, and the left was demanding free speech. Now it's exactly the opposite. It's the left which is trying to smash free speech, and it's the right which is demanding free speech, demanding the right to speak at universities. And so it's not that I think the left is evil and the right is good. But there's something else, and that is it gets back to the point of monopolies. I think monopolies tend to be dangerous. And so because you have this leftist monopoly in academia, monopolies don't want competition. They don't want free speech, and they're trying to oppose it. And you have all these new concepts like microaggression. It's very interesting. It's, how should I put it? They're, as one scholar put it, medicalizing opposing speech. In other words, if you disagree with me on any topic, it could be race, it could be politics, it could be economics, it could be morality. If you disagree with me, even if you're good at giving good reasons, even if you've done your research, and I think I may think that you're wrong, I think that your position is dangerous for society, but you actually did your research. Doesn't mean you're right. It just means that you are engaged in rational discourse, whether you're right or wrong. And so they're now saying that that discourse is a medical threat because I can be traumatized. And so universities have to have safe spaces where people are not exposed to opposing views. Now, what neurologists are saying is, what neurologists, I mean, I'm talking about top scholars who do all the research. This is science now. This is not political opinion. This is science. What neurologists are saying is that this is the worst possible thing, the most destructive possible thing you can do for people. I mean, to give kind of like, the vulgar expression, it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. And neurologically, it's like if you take a baby and keep this baby in an incubator for the first 15 years of its life, basically, it's going to, as soon as it comes out, it's going to die of some disease that doesn't bother us. I mean, that's what happened to the, when the Spanish came to the New World. Millions of people, it was almost like bacterial genocide because they had no antibodies. And so it's actually weakening people. And scholars have noticed that it used to be, and these, again, this is real scholarship, that let's say up until about the mid-90s, for many decades, sometimes the administrators of a university wanted to restrict speech in certain ways on this side or that side, or professors, but the students always defended free speech. Up until about the mid-90s, the students always defended free speech. Now it's flipped. So that the students are claiming that if people simply disagree with me, that is a medical threat. And therefore, I have to be protected from the danger of hearing some other viewpoint. And you get that because you have such a monopoly of leftist and even extreme left views that the students are like, they feel threatened by it. So if you want to understand Trump, like why would people elect someone who obviously, during the campaign, it became very obvious that he's mentally unstable and not healthy. I mean, it was obvious. It was obvious this person has mental problems. And so, but because people, another thing is, just be very honest, because again, I'm not taking sides, but latest studies show in America that among Caucasian people, they feel there's more white bashing than there is bashing. Because if you look at America, for example, here's some statistics. the liberal press has given the impression that America is a country where, for their own amusement, white cops go around just like shooting blacks, almost just for their own amusement. The real numbers are, number one, that per capita, I mean by percentages, not by absolute numbers, that a white policeman is more likely to kill a white person than a black person. These are the actual statistics, which the media will never say. That the number of white people in America, and this is not a racism thing. I mean, I'm just giving you statistics. Anyone that wants to walk in the door and be rational, you're my friend. I mean, I personally couldn't care less what kind of body you have. It means nothing to me. It's about, do you have a brain and are you a good person? But the real numbers are that the number of white people killed by blacks is many, many times higher than the number of black people killed by whites. And what's interesting is that the media never, ever talks about it.
You'll never see that.
No, they'll never say it. So of course, America is now seen, and is seen as a country where white policemen just go around practically like, almost like for recreational hunting, just go around, hunting black people. And there is some abuse. It should be punished. It should be wiped out, obviously. Any amount of abuse like that is not acceptable. But
that's a very serious statistic to stay hidden.
It is.
It's a very serious statistic.
Yeah.
It's the same phenomenon in Germany, actually. It's exactly the same.
Yeah, exactly.
With violence-based through immigration, that it's just not being talked about.
Yeah.
We just had that discussion.
For example, there was a case in Ferguson, Missouri. This is just facts. I mean, personally, I couldn't care less what kind of body you have. Really, I really don't care. It's unless you have a body that makes a lot of money and you want to share it with me, then we'll talk. There was a city in Ferguson, Missouri, where basically a white cop shot and killed a black adolescent, I think, or youth. I don't know exactly how old he was. Now, the word prejudice means you judge before the facts are in. You prejudge. That's what the word means. So what we saw was an extraordinary exhibition of racism and prejudice, but it went the other way. Because all over America, there were demonstrations. Students were like, screaming and yelling because this is racism, that this was almost like execution style murder. But the interesting thing is, all these demonstrations were going on before investigation. Now, the person in charge, it was such a controversial issue that the federal government took over the investigation because it was just so heavy. Now, at that time in America, the top legal officer in America is called the Attorney General. And the Attorney General at that time, under Obama, was an African American. So you have an African American Attorney General investigating at the order of an African American president. And on the left, they did not wait to hear what the investigation said. And this was not like the investigation just now in the Kavanaugh case. This was not like a kind of a silly one-week investigation. This was a serious investigation. But what's interesting is that all these demonstrations went on, and there were two versions of what happened. One version was a racist white cop just brutally murdered an innocent black kid. The other version, which turned out to be kind of, true, was that, first of all, this African American youth was about, 6'3", 6'5", weighed about 300 pounds, and he was crazy on drugs, and he was trying to kill the policeman. The policeman was, had a perfect record, had never been accused of any type of racial profiling, was just a guy that followed all the rules, including rules regarding how to treat different races. And so none of these people, they didn't want to know about the investigation. That's what the word prejudice means. They had two facts. All they needed was 2 facts. They didn't need an investigation. The 2 facts were white cop, black victim. That's all they needed. That's all they needed. That is a classic textbook case of prejudice. And when the investigation actually was completed by an African American attorney general working under an African American president, they could not find that the policeman actually violated the law, because apparently this guy crazed, I mean, his race is not important, just some huge guy crazed on drugs who punched the policeman in the face. I don't know what happens in Australia when you punch a policeman in the face and then try to grab his gun. I mean, maybe they just, I don't know what they do, but in most places, they respond. Punch the guy in the face, grabbing for his gun. So, and yet, for the left, this is an egregious, clear example of white racism against blacks. And you know, people, they notice these things. They notice these things. And they notice that the incredible amount of white bashing that goes on. I'm not a white supremacist. I'm not, again, I don't care what kind of bodies people have. I'm just trying to have a rational discussion. Like you get these things which I think are just sort of kind of unbecoming, like Stanford University. I remember they issued this press release several years ago. You know, Stanford is top tier. They issued this press release in which they were just like openly bragging. They were jubilant, celebrating. They'd achieved this tremendous victory because they'd managed to get the percentage of white students under 50%. So there were less than 50% white students, and this was like a tremendous victory for them. And so if you're a white person and you're like a contagion, it's like your presence in a university is kind of a, ooh, you know, we don't want, especially white males. And so, you know what I mean? It just goes on and on and on. If there's anything like a political, like that thing in Ferguson, Missouri, it's always the white person's fault in the press. And so, again, what I want personally is just to live in a rational society.
But it's almost like the hate has just moved around.
Yes, it absolutely has. Absolutely has. In my life, because I grew up in a very liberal part of the country in Los Angeles, in terms of my own human, and I'm not saying this is my experience. I'm not saying my experience can be universalized. I'm not claiming that this is the way the world is. My experience, most of the prejudice I experienced growing up was black prejudice against white people. It doesn't mean black people are bad. It doesn't mean white people are good. It just means that was my personal experience of being physically threatened, of seeing people, you know, being subject to violence, of being, that's just, again, my experience is not the world. My experience is not everywhere. It's just my experience. And so, so the reason I mention all this is because as a wannabe spiritual teacher, I think it's dangerous for me to fall into political sectarianism on the right or the left.
Yeah.
I mean, for me to become politically sectarian,
Then you still.
yeah, I think I'm in a sense betraying my vocation if I do that.
100%.
And so, so as far as, let's say, like in Brazil, the left or the right, I mean, it would be an interesting discussion. I would like to see a learned discussion among, for example, economists who aren't personally invested in the outcome either way. Because the debate over what is the best way to, let's say, economically structure a nation is a very serious topic. It's not that easy to get a PhD in economics. And it's very complicated. There's like millions of variables. And so how do you actually create wealth? I mean, let's say if we all agree that we want the greatest prosperity for the greatest number of people, and even people, let's say, who, for whatever reason, which probably doesn't include just laziness and desire to exploit other people, let's say any person that just does their best, as a citizen, should be guaranteed, obviously, medical care and security and a decent life if they're trying their best. So obviously. And so how do you achieve that in a way that, I'll give you two examples. In, what was the year? I can't remember how many years ago. It must be like about 8 years ago. No, 7 or 8 years ago. La France. On parle de la France maintenant. In France, they elected François Hollande. And he was elected from the Socialist Party, which up until very recently was an important party in France, and it got just annihilated in the last presidential election. But anyway, he, in his campaign, he was like really classic bash the rich. He was like totally Robin Hood, steal from the rich, give to the poor. He was like, and he really had this, and he really kind of, because I watched the news in French, I watch the news in French every day from France 24. So I really have a picture of what's going on in France. And if you see clips of his campaign about 7 or 8 years ago, if you see clips of his campaign, he was really Robin Hood, like these bad rich people, we're gonna redistribute wealth and everything. And so he was elected. And people couldn't take Sarkozy anymore. And so he was elected, and he started kind of doing socialist things. Some things were just like, are you serious? It was like if you made more than $1 million in France, you were taxed, I think, like 90% of your income. And so, to make a long story short, well, first of all, let me say this, and then I'll show you that this is true about what happened. There is a major, I believe, and of course I may be wrong, but as far as I know, as far as I've been able to understand it, there's one really good thing about socialism, which I like, which is we're all responsible for everybody else. We're all responsible. No one in our society who is, just doing their best, whatever that is. People may have medical disabilities, they may have mental disabilities, they may just have bad luck. But anyone who's just doing their best, not killing themselves, but just making a sincere effort, should be guaranteed a reasonable life. So you don't live in squalor and poverty. So that I think is excellent. That I totally agree with. Society should be one family. Actually, the whole world is one family, including the animals, including everyone. Every living thing is a family. So that part of socialism, I absolutely agree with. I think it must be that way. The part of socialism, which is kind of a little cuckoo, is they believe falsely, and that was revealed under Hollande, that the national wealth, what you can call the national wealth, is a fixed amount. And so what we're really debating is, how do we divide the pie? Okay, right now, a few people got most of the pie and everyone else getting crumbs. So that's not right. And so basically, their idea is we have to redivide the pie in a much more fair way so everybody gets a fair piece of the pie. Now, the flaw in this thinking is that the wealth of a nation is not a fixed amount. It's constantly in fluctuation, and it absolutely depends on having people in your country that know how to make money. So what happened under Hollande, I'll tell you what happened. First of all, a lot of people in France that had a lot of money, they just left. And then another thing is, because of these, kind of leftist government regulations in France, and what I'm saying now is something that everyone, all the economists in France know this. What I'm reporting to you is what I learned by listening to top economists in France, and not just on the right. It's kind of like, this is the way it is. There's all these academic discussions. And not only from academics, in France, up until very recently, it has been incredibly difficult to start a business because there are so many regulations. There's so much bureaucracy. That what happened is, there's a lot of very smart people in France, And a lot of the top economists in the world are in France or come from France, so they're really good at this. You had what's called brain drain. So a lot of the smartest entrepreneurs in France left. I mean, a huge, like for example, in Silicon Valley, there's something like 60,000 French people. And we're talking about like really smart people who are ambitious, and they just left. And so what happened under Hollande basically is the French economy crashed. And if you watch the news in French, the news from Paris in French, every other word was chômage, 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 unemployment. There were no jobs because it's interesting in German, Deutsch. It's funny, the way they say that, because German, there's certain logic German. The way they say employer and employee is Arbeitgeber and Arbeitnehmer. Arbeitgeber means a work giver. Arbeitnehmer, Geber. And an employee is an Arbeitnehmer. And there's actually a truth in that. Because it's actually not easy to create a profitable business. Try it. We have a lot of poor devotees in the Hare Krishna movement. And they have at least 15 different businesses, none of which succeeded. I mean, I don't mean that every Hare Krishna is bad at business, but we definitely do not have less than the national average. So to start a successful business is not easy.
You have to be brave.
Brave, you just got to be good at it.
To take the risk ongoingly or the headache that comes with it.
And you have to be good at it because a lot of people take the risk and go bankrupt.
Yeah.
Lots of people take the risk and start businesses. It just doesn't work. Yeah, I mean, I mean, most of the businesses that people start don't make it. Probably, a huge percentage of them.
80%.
Yeah, 80%. So if you have people in your country who are just good at it, number one, you don't want to smother them in government regulations. And I saw these interviews in French, and they were interviewing farmers and just, small businesses. We're not talking about the evil multinationals. We're talking about just ordinary French people that live in, different parts of the country or just have little businesses. Maybe they employ 5 people, 10 people, 20 people. And they were saying it's impossible. You can't do it in this country. You can't do it. You can't, because to start a business, they bury you alive under rules and regulations. Yeah, and coming from the left, of course. And so what happened under Hollande, the economy crashed. His ratings went, crashed. And he had to actually do a U-turn. And the same François Hollande, during his campaign, was like, let's just, they're stealing all our money. He suddenly had to literally go around, saying, hi, Mr. Entrepreneur, rich person, what can I do for you? How can I help you? And he made a trip to Silicon Valley, trying to convince intelligent, young French entrepreneurs to come back. Like, we're not going to kill you. We're not going to take 90% of everything you make. I mean, frankly, who wants to work hard, yourself, and then you get to keep 10% of it? I mean, seriously?
Yeah.
If you can't just be an employee somewhere else.
Oh, there's this joke. George W. Bush was obviously one of the most intellectual national leaders of our time. And so they say, I don't know this joke, we really said it. Because when France didn't support, the U.S. after 9/11 and the war in Afghanistan and all that, so there's anti-French sentiment. So he said, French don't understand anything about business. They don't even have a word for entrepreneur.
It's funny this year. Crazy. My accountant called me this year and says, I'm sorry, you have to pay 50% tax. And my first thought was, I don't want to work if I have to pay 50% tax.
Yeah.
That's my accountant said that.
Yeah. So the real challenge is, how do you encourage entrepreneurs so that they want to do business? Because they're the ones that create employment. If you don't have Arbeitgeber, if you don't have work givers, there's no work. And yet, how do you do that in a way and yet stop them from just exploiting society, stop them from, frankly, the cruelty which is typical of capitalists? They're not all cruel, but a lot of them are. And you see, you have to understand what the word capitalism means. Capitalism is not identical with free market. Because if you look back at history, there were free markets. I mean, look back at the ancient world, the Silk Road, the Great Silk Road that went from Asia, China, and India and came up through Europe. That's why Columbus was sailing, because the Ottomans, the Muslim Ottomans conquered Constantinople. The Roman Empire lasted 1,000 years after the fall of Rome. The Roman Empire actually lasted another 1,000 years. It was the Eastern Empire because it had two parts of the Roman Empire. And so when Constantinople, if you look at a map, is right in the middle between Asia and the West. And those were the two great population centers. You can't sustain a large population in a desert for obvious reasons. And so world trade was basically between Europe and Asia. And that world trade, if you look at a map, because of geographic boundaries and things, tended to go through Constantinople. And so when the Muslims conquered Constantinople, which had stood there for it was a city that had been there for over 1,000 years. It was the city that could never be defeated. It was Constantinople. And so when Constantinople fell, it was a crisis. It was in the West. It was an economic crisis, and that's why the Europeans became desperate. Not they just we can't get spices anymore. God, where am I going to get my cinnamon and aspartame? Yeah, I mean that's stupid. It wasn't just about. It was about world trade, and so therefore Europe became desperate to find some other way to trade with Asia that didn't go through the Muslim empires because so they went around Africa. Columbus tried to go. Interestingly, Columbus was trying to get to East India when Lord Chaitanya was there.
Oh, wow.
Hey, come on in. I'm just trying my best to brainwash them and turn them into mindless cult followers. Hey, come on in, have a seat. Pull up a chair if you have chairs. Chairs are us. So, why did I bring all that up?
Because of the way the thought has been suppressed and not,
I guess,
free thinking.
oh yeah, I know what I was saying. Because they had free market. I mean, world trade, there were rich people. There have always been rich people. There's always been world trade. It's not that capitalism brought us free markets. Capitalism is much worse than that. Capitalism actually takes the accumulated. First of all, you couldn't have the word capitalism until you have capital as the main commodity. If you look back before the Industrial Revolution, what was wealth? Wealth was land. Wealth was jewels, grains. That was a huge part of wealth. You had a lot of grains. In fact, in ancient Sanskrit, the word for a rich person is in ancient Sanskrit is bahuvrihi, which literally means one who has a lot of grain. That's one of the ways. I mean, that's not the only way. That's one of the ways you say a rich person has a lot of grain. So in agrarian societies, it's grains, it's jewels, it's land, especially land, because land produces wealth. That's why France was the richest country in Europe, because if you look at a map, it has the largest amount of good land for agriculture. Germany gets too cold in the north, so the growing season is much less. That's why, frankly, for the last 2,500 years, Germans were trying to come to France. That's how Julius Caesar made his career. He stopped the Germans from invading the Gauls in France. But anyway, but then with the Industrial Revolution, it's unwieldy. It's just not practical. When you're mass producing things, you can't, it's not just the barter system. You can't bring, for example, 50,000 shirts to the local farmer's market. And so therefore you need some way to represent products. In other words, you can't bring thousands and millions of products to a market. So therefore you have to have some symbolic representation of your goods. And that symbolic representation is, of course, capital, is money. So you don't bring 10,000 shirts or let's say, or 5,000 water buffaloes. You're trading with Asia. You can't bring that to a market. What you do bring is money. You bring money to the market. You bring capital. And so there's this whole change in the world. And suddenly, but what happens with capitalism is it becomes a religion. So let's say, for example, in America, you have some American person owns a company. And let's say that person is manufacturing all his or her goods in China. Now, let's say that is hurting U.S. economies, taking jobs away, and so on and so forth. But it's a sacred principle. I have a right to make a profit. I have a right to make a big profit, not only a profit, but as much profit as I can. And so therefore, profit comes even before the national interest. And so you have capitalism actually, in a way, replacing nationalism. Because from the point of view of the capitalist, not just making up, like it's not like I have a right to make a living, I have to feed my family. It's not that. It's I have a right to become ridiculously wealthy. And even if people are starving near me, I'd still rather buy my 11th mansion, which I'll probably never live in. I may spend like 7 days there in the next 20 years, but that's more important. Or I'm going to buy a very expensive car. Well, people are going hungry, don't have clean drinking water. I'm going to buy my, another expensive car, which burns a lot of gas and pollutes the environment. And so capitalism is not just an economic system, it's actually a moral philosophy, which there's something sacred about accumulating capital. There's actually something sacred about it, so that my right to accumulate capital is more important than any other moral consideration. And so there really is something evil in predatory capitalism. And Trump was very much a predatory capitalist. It's very well known that he drove families out of business, ruined people's lives, because he was working on his next billion. And so what I see is, personally, and as an ISKCON guru, I see everything. That was a joke. That was a joke. I hope you know that was a joke. But what I see is that on the extreme left and on the extreme right, you have very, very crazy, dangerous people. Again, Hitler killed 20 million people. Marxists and communists killed 100 million. But what's interesting is that on university campuses, you can still go on a Western liberal campus and say, I'm a Marxist. Try going on a Western campus and saying, I am a Nazi in the German sense of the word. Like, I'm a Nazi. I think Hitler had the right idea, and I'm a Nazi. Try that on your local campus.
Probably not.
Yeah, or maybe don't try that. And yet, what's interesting is you can still go on a Western campus and hold the flag of a group of people that killed 5 times more people than Hitler. Mm. And so, there's a whole new branch of cognitive science, by the way, which is called motivated reasoning. Motivated reasoning. And what this branch of cognitive science shows is that when people are emotionally attached to a certain political position, economic, religious, whatever it is, they will filter out all contradictory evidence. And they will only see the evidence that supports their case. And this is true for university professors, it's true for scholars, it's true for scientists. It's true for, so for example, I'll give you two examples, the left and the right, because I'm really not right or left. I just like things to be reasonable. You have this like horrible case of science denial, denying science on the right, in the form of denying human-caused climate change. So the present government in America pulled out of the Paris Accord and just, basically acted like stupid pigs. Actually, I feel like I'm insulting pigs. Because actually pigs are intelligent, unlike some of these politicians. But anyway, so that's what happened. They just deny science. And what they do is, they have their little collection of scientists who have PhDs and teach in universities who say, no, there is no climate change caused by human activity. And so in the same way, on the left, you have the same thing. Because you have this massive evidence of gender difference. I'm not talking about superiority or inferiority. It's not about that. Gender difference. For example, the country in the world that has the most ferocious, like fanatical laws against gender discrimination is Sweden. And Sweden also has the highest percentages of men and women choosing different vocations. I remember I had this when I was at UCLA, when I was a student at UCLA, I had this philosophy class. And so we were all there one day. I was a cult member back then. I was in the Hare Krishna movement. And so that was post Kool-Aid. Anyway, so I remember that we were sitting there in the class one day and waiting for the teacher. And so some guys were really trying to please there were the few like really pretty girls in the class. And some guys were really trying to impress them. And so they were like coming out with a really strong feminist theory about men and women are equal. And so the prettiest girl in the class, probably if you took a vote, she would definitely win. But the prettiest girl in the class said, that's nonsense. That's not true at all. I remember that. She said that, it's a little seminar room. She said that my parents were fanatical gender equality people. Fanatical. Like every boy I ever had was gender neutral. And she said, guess what? I'm not a guy, I'm a girl. And I mean, she didn't think she was inferior. She didn't think, I mean, she was a very bright person and strong character. There's no question of I'm less than a man, but I'm not a man. I actually gave a talk on that yesterday, in which I gave some of the current statistics. So again, you have this massive social science showing that girls and boys are different. For example, girls are much more likely to enter the medical profession. And the medical profession is not for stupid people. I pray that stupid people do not go into the medical profession. I mean, obviously in America, I'm sure like Australia, it's extremely competitive to be a doctor. Yeah. And even to get like into a top nursing school. And yet women are tending to dominate the medical profession. Because why? Because they want to, because that's what they're choosing to do. Because a lot more women than men want to heal people, take care of people, because women, I mean, I know this is like a crude generalization, but actually there's a lot of social science. Women just tend to be nicer. And, they tend to be nice. And I hope they are, because they're the ones who usually raise children. I hope they're nice. So, whereas men, let's say high-risk occupations, like do you want to go out in an oil rig out in the middle of some frozen ocean, where if you fall off, you will like die a horrible frozen, or do you want to become a martial artist? Do you want to go, And so, yes, some women do all these things, but many, many, many times more men want to do risky jobs. Women are not so. I mean, look at if you are neurologically wired, you can say by evolution, you can say by God, it's irrelevant. If you are neurologically wired to protect children, to raise children, to be a mother, and you love taking risks, this is not good evolution. This is a bad combination. And so obviously, that's why women are more inclined. We're talking neurology here. This is not culture. This is not, no, it's just because the men controlled society and they brainwashed them. No. We're talking about neurology here. Because when you look at societies that have the most fanatical gender equality laws, it makes no difference. It makes absolutely no difference. You get exactly the same result. Why? Because thank God women have enough common sense to do what they want and to actually use the freedom they have to do what they want to do. So, like at Google, there was that famous case at Google where there was some engineer there who just, all he did was he referred to the science on the subject, showing that women prefer, for example, medical, that's not the only job, that's one of the things they like to do. And men are more inclined toward engineering because what the studies show is women are more interested in people. Like my mother. I mean, we always had my parents would always host these family events and different, religious holidays and different things. And my father, I mean, he didn't have any idea what was going on. It was like, just okay, dear, yeah, right. He didn't know about it. He didn't want to know about it. And my mother would arrange everything. Why? Because women tend to be more interested in people. They're just more interested in people. And I mean, that's certainly, that would hardly make you less intelligent. If anything, it gives you a higher emotional IQ. So, and men are more interested in things. So a little girl may have her doll and the guy is like trying to take a machine apart or something. So guys are more interested in abstract things. Therefore, men tend to be much better in mathematics because it's all abstract, whereas women are better at things involving people. And so, again, this has nothing to do with, who's better, who's smarter. It has nothing to do with that. It's just letting people do what they want to do. And so on the left, you get just as much science denial on the left as on the right. But the media only talks about science denial on the right. The media constantly talks about the stupid denial of human-caused climate change on the right. They always talk about that. They never talk about the equally stupid science denial on the left. And actually, that's not the only one on the left. And that's not the only one on the right. So my conclusion is that I really don't like fanaticism. I don't care what side it's on. I don't care if it's political, religious. What really kind of galvanized my conviction on this, really made me like I had this strong antipathy to fanaticism of any kind, is I spent a couple of months in Israel. And which is a great country, by the way, I should say. I mean, I really like it. I mean, apart from the political mess, and there's a lot of, and I met a lot of nice people, actually Jews and Muslims, and I had a great time there. And I really love that country. But there are people in Israel, fanatical Orthodox people, who are not the majority, and who are very unpopular among Israelis. Israelis can't stand them, but you get these Orthodox fanatics, and then of course you get some Muslim fanatics. And seeing it, because Israel is so small, it's like it's all right there on top of you. It's not like I live in LA and I've heard that out somewhere in Alabama, which is like 2,000 miles away. It's not like that. It's like, it's just right there. And I just, because people who are fanatic, I mean, the definition of fanaticism is that your claims go beyond your evidence. That's what fanatical means. It means you have this much evidence, but you're talking this much. And so I think the real problem, and so basically, when the election of Trump, you have the pendulum effect. You have one fanaticism, as Marx said, creating its equal and opposite fanaticism. And so, I mean, that's one of the first laws of Newton. That's one of Newton's first laws of motion. That any action, any force in nature will produce an equal and opposite force. the first person to talk about the pendulum effect in the West was Galileo, who was, of course, unfairly imprisoned by the church and who was extremely obnoxious. But anyway, that's the lesser known fact about Galileo. It's one of the reasons he got in prison. But anyway, so the pendulum effect, what you're really seeing, and what you're really seeing in America with this, somewhat barbarian or very much barbarian leader, is the pendulum effect. Because you had as much nonsense and fanaticism and irrational science denial on the left. And you have the left in universities, in America, a lot of people go to school, college. You have this unmitigated bullying. You have this bullying behavior on campus, where if you're conservative, even if you're a reasonable conservative, even if social science actually is on your side on a particular issue, you're just bullied, you're harassed, you're shamed. And so monopolies tend to be, so I watch a lot of debates, and on YouTube and everything, various kinds of political debates, intelligent design versus unguided evolution. And what I'm finding more and more, and I really think I'm being fair. I mean, no one's absolutely fair, but I think I'm fair enough. I think I have enough intellectual integrity that I'm not just hearing what I want to hear. I think the real intellectual momentum right now is on the right. I don't mean the stupid right. I mean the intelligent right. Not the stupid right. There is a very stupid right, and that's not what I'm talking about. And by intellectual momentum, I mean people that really do their research, they check their facts, they actually listen to what the other people are saying and speak to the other people's arguments. Because when you have a monopoly, you have this leftist tyranny on campus. And it really is like tyrannical. You have this leftist tyranny. I just talked to a disciple of mine yesterday, Yolanda, who's a brilliant student. She's at the University of Texas now. She's Australian, by the way. Oi, oi, oi. And she is from probably the most powerful city in Australia, which is Bunbury, West Australia. Anyway, she'll probably hear this. I don't want to embarrass her because she'll probably watch this. But yeah, she's really, really smart, really smart. And she's studying to be a constitutional law professor. And she was just telling me she's in this class, and she's like, she has to go through these classes where, all this like heavy leftist indoctrination is going on. It's not education. There's no other viewpoint. There are good arguments on both sides, but you never hear the arguments on the other side. There's good arguments on both sides. Again, we're not talking about stupid, right? You'll never hear that. And if you dare to really oppose what you have to call leftist orthodoxy, religious orthodoxy, you're in serious danger. You could be destroying your career. You could be ruining your life if you dare to say what you really think with intellectual honesty. So if you want to talk about stupid, let's talk about stupid left and stupid right. The stupid left basically produced this, or let's say reinvigorated. There's always been a stupid right. It reinvigorated the stupid right because it became so abusive. My experience is when even like friends of mine and people that there are very intelligent people on the left, but the tendency is that if you're just, let's say like in California, if I'm just with, say friends, because I know a lot of people in California, and California is, they call it the fruit and nut state. I mean, it's very much, in California, I didn't feel I had to vote because we already know. Yeah. There was this like gigantic landslide for Hillary Clinton in the whole West Coast, Washington State, Oregon, and California. There's no question. It would take literally an act of God for someone like Trump to get a majority in California. It would be really like a miracle. Like, oh my God, it's like parting the Red Sea. So because, I'm from there and I live there, if you dare to deviate from political correctness, you won't get a rational argument. You won't say, okay, look at these numbers, social science, history. What you'll get is you'll be name called, you're a racist, you're a sexist. First, you'll be called names, and then in other ways, they will attempt to shame you into giving up your evil views. Again, they won't bring in social science. They won't bring in serious academic history, not sort of, mythological leftist history. They won't, because, it's just like if you look at the leftist, feminist take on, say, 19th century England. I mean, obviously, it didn't meet our standards of gender equality, and so I'm not saying that. But the caricature you get in sort of extreme left, again, a term you'll never hear in universities or in the media, extreme left feminist ideology is, all you have to do is read literature from the 19th century, for example, Jane Austen, literature written by women, and literature which in its time was considered to be almost like shockingly realistic. If you look at like when Jane Austen wrote her books, and she's pre-Victorian, we're talking about like, in the teens of the 1800s. And people like Sir Walter Scott, who was a giant literary figure back then, and other people, they were like, wow, this is so realistic. Like she's really telling it like it is. And so if you look at literature that in its time was considered to be like revolutionary realism, you find the position of women is very different. It's not great, it's not satisfactory, it's not good enough, but it's not at all what the radical left would have you believe. It's very different. In terms of the power of women, their role in society, in many ways, it's just not what you would believe if you listen to the radical left. So Trump, yeah, I'll tell you who gave us Trump. The stupid academic left. That's who gave us Trump. Because you see, you can't get that. This is just like, it's Newton's laws of motion. How do you get a swing? It's like if you're a sociologist, if you're a historian, it's like, let's say, for example, this bottle, and this bottle suddenly flies against the wall. I mean, something happened. You don't say, you stupid bottle, why did you fly against the wall? And so most people, most people, as you may have noticed, are not geniuses. And so if in America you suddenly get this political swing, what happened? If you were serious, of course, the easiest way out is just start calling names and all that. And the advantage of that is you actually don't have to use many brain cells. Yeah. But if you're a historian, if you're a social scientist, it's just like if you suddenly see the bottle fly against the wall, what happened? Where did that come from? Is it just that people in America suddenly became evil? No, they were all right. No, America, it's actually a lot of nice people. It's like in Australia. Like I'm walking around Australia, or just around here, and I think people are great. People are just really nice. I think they're just really nice people. Obviously, you have your problem cases. But I think in general, people are just really nice here. I think they're great people. In America, there's a lot of really nice people. So what happened? Again, if you approach it like a scientist, what happened? Why this swing? And the obvious explanation, I think, pendulum effect.
It makes sense.
So then you can ask the question, the chicken or egg question, who first pulled the pendulum? Who first pulled the pendulum to an extreme? Who started the motion? And, we could debate that. I have my own views. But, and I think I think this is a case where Hegel was right. Professor Hegel. The Professor Doctor. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Hegel, and he was very famous, Hegel introduced, or at least popularized, this idea of historical dialectic. And then Marx kind of, anyway, took it too far. But for Marx, by the way, religion is an opiate, it's a drug. It's just like, in other words, it makes you crazy. And then for Freud, it's a mental disease. Interesting. But anyway, Hegel said that there's a thesis. Thesis just means the status quo, just the way things are now. That's the thesis. That's the status quo. It's just the way things are now. And what happens is, and this is like Newtonian laws of motion, every status quo, unless it's like perfectly balanced, and that doesn't happen in this world. Unless the status quo is perfectly balanced, it's going to be a little bit to this side or that side, left or right. And sometimes it goes very far to the left or right. And the more the status quo is to this side or that side, the more it must necessarily create an equal and opposite reaction. And so that reaction is called the antithesis. Antithesis. Yeah, well, you get the antithesis. And then, of course, you get this, and then, it keeps moving, and hopefully if let's say, if further extremism is not introduced into the system, then eventually it balances.
Can you explain a little bit why?
Why?
Why you think there's the pendulum effect?
Well, because I know. Oh, you mean philosophically? Why should there be such a thing?
Yeah.
Okay. I will now theologize the pendulum effect. I can theologize anything.
We thought that magic wand.
I'm a religious fanatic. I can theologize anything. I quote the good book, Bhagavad Gita. I'm quoting the Bhagavad Gita. That's the good book. The Lord said that. Because I think that actually I will quote the Bhagavad Gita. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says that in all human activities, not just your spiritual stuff, but in your human activities, you have to be balanced. You have to be moderate. Yuktahara viharasya, like don't eat too much, don't eat too little. Don't sleep too much, don't sleep too little. And so when you go off center, when you start getting extreme, you're kind of triggering a reaction from the universe or from nature. Because when you go to it's like if you eat too much, you're not respecting your own soul, because you're not the body, you're a soul, and therefore you should respect your own eternal soul by not pigging out. And if you eat too little, again, you're not respecting your body, because the body is a gift of God, and you have to respect it and take care of it. And so if you eat too little, you're harming what ultimately doesn't belong to you. That's a gift. And so there's something you could say, I think you could make some kind of argument that there is something intrinsically, innately wrong with extremes. That somehow extremes, whether political, nutritional, religious, economic, cultural, social, linguistic, I mean, there's something about extremes which somehow
it moves away from something honorable. It moves away from that.
Yes, it moves away from a divine plan. It moves away from the way things are meant to be for our ultimate good. Because ultimately the universe is teleological. Telos in Greek means a purpose, an end. And so teleology means that there are intrinsic purposes in the universe. I mean, obviously, you can create a purpose. You can say, today I want to go, I want to go walk on the beach today. So you create a purpose for yourself. That's a subjective purpose. You could change your mind and suddenly it's not your purpose. So the question of teleology is, are there purposes built into the universe? So even if you don't accept it, it's still your purpose.
But don't you think we have that as our coming into this world? We have our, whatever our journey is.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, correct.
Absolutely. But you see, the materialists will tend to say, no, there are no objective purposes. But even, you see, you have to be careful there, because you have to make a distinction between a subjective purpose, which is in a sense ordained by your karma. Like there's certain things you had to learn. So in a sense, yes, it's an objective.
I'm a slow learner.
No, you're a true blue Aussie. Yeah. So if, let's say, just for the sake of analysis, let's assume that there actually are objective purposes in the universe, and we are all born with purposes, and that ultimately God is good, not some evil genius that controls the universe, like Descartes talked about that. Let's say if God is good, and God meaning just ultimately the ultimate truth. If God is good, then objective purposes are always beneficial.
So how can you see the world as anything else?
Well, if you're a good person, you can't. But because that means because to say something is objective as a purpose means it must be God's purpose for you. Otherwise, how could it be objective? It would just be your opinion, or the government's opinion, or whatever. So to be, in an ultimate sense, objective, a purpose has to come from an absolute source. Yeah, from an absolute source. God is within us. And so if that's the case, if there are objective purposes, and if God is good, two premises. If there are objective purposes, and if God is good, then it follows logically that those objective purposes are beneficial.
Maharaj, don't you think that Gita was a kind of almost fanatical mise-en-scene? It was the extreme.
Oh, that was cool. Mise-en-scene, that's good. Fanatical?
Well, because he was, the whole situation was pushed so far that there had to be war. So
Krishna, but again, you have to remember about the Bhagavad Gita war is that these were professional soldiers.
Yeah.
They were not drafted. This was not like some kind of do-it-yourself militia. I mean, to give an example, to understand the Battle of Kuruksetra, imagine this situation. Imagine you woke up one morning, well, Australia, very unlikely. But let's say you woke up one morning in Australia.
If you're lucky.
Let's say you woke up and some radical fascist militaristic group had somehow taken over the government in Canberra. I mean, not likely, but let's say that happened. And let's say it turns out that the Australian military was loyal to the Constitution and went to Canberra to restore a constitutional government. No one would blame them. I mean, who would criticize them for doing that? That's what the Bhagavad Gita is. Vedic culture was constitutional government.
When you talk about the objective purpose.
Well, just wrap that. That's all right. That's all right. We'll still feed you. So if you look, for example, at Mahabharata, it was constitutional government. It was not absolute monarchy. Absolute monarchy, which, the most famous example is Louis XIV, l'état c'est moi. I am the state, it's me. That was not European tradition. Look at the Magna Carta. If you look at, in Europe, historically, I'm not defending European monarchy because it went to very weird places, but in general, structurally, it was, and they use the Latin term, that the king or the monarch or the queen was primo inter pares, in Latin, first among equals. So the idea was there are different nobles, and among the nobles, one is most important, and that person holds the throne. And if you look at European thrones, would shift among noble houses. It didn't always stay with the same line. And so then with, the idea of absolute monarchy, the idea that l'état c'est moi, that there are no other rules. The only rule is I do whatever I want. And so that was a political extreme, which in the case of France led to the French Revolution. Directly. That's a perfect example of a historical dialectic. And so in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna is restoring balance. Krishna is restoring constitutional government. And all the people on the battlefield are, they're not a bunch of people running around killing their families. The people on the battlefield are all professional warriors. And civil wars, even if you look at say the history of European warfare, because there was not a huge number of royal families, and the royal families would tend to lead the battle. They would tend to be warriors, knights, and so on. And so practically every European war was a war among families. Practically every European war, at least in older times, you had people fighting against people in their own family, their extended families. And the same was true at Kuruksetra, simply because that's what you get when you have royal families. There's, it's a limited number. But still, Krishna was restoring constitutional government. He was restoring balance. And so, and not by going to the other extreme. And this is one of those rare cases where, let's say something has gone to an extreme and someone has the maturity, the intelligence to bring it back to the middle. Now, what we're finding is in the modern politics in America, you say the extreme left, sorry if I keep saying it, a term not really used on campuses or in the press, but the extreme left, and then you have the extreme right. And so, and everyone, I mean, in America, almost everyone who has a brain is saying this now. A lot of people are saying now in America, what happened to moderation? What happened to balance? What happened to respectful discourse? And frankly, I'll tell you what happened. And so I would say that in America, what has, I don't want to say destroyed, but what has really weakened rational discourse is two fanatical groups, which are the, let's say, evangelical Christianity and the academic left. And you could argue that actually we have a pendulum there. Because you have this fanatical Christianity, this born-again Christianity, where basically if you don't join our church, you're evil. You're evil. You're not only like, I think you're not really clear on your theology, but you're actually evil. And so you have this culture there where you have all these religious fanatics, and they kind of created their equal opposite. And so then you get equally fanatical. Remember Newton's law of motion, an equal and opposite force. You get another community equally fanatical on the other side. And so because the left, what happened is, it's interesting. On the religious side, what the studies show is that America has become more moderate. For example, the latest studies show, or at least a few years ago, that among all Christian groups, like whatever church, Catholic, Protestant, anyone, just anyone's roughly a Christian, 2/3 of Christians in America believe that you can go to heaven in another religion. 2/3. But again, read the liberal media, you won't know it. Watch Hollywood movies, you won't know it. So 2/3. So what's happening in America, and this is what happened. You had this fanatical Christianity. It produced an equally fanatical atheism, Marxism, Marxist-inspired academia. Meanwhile, in this dialectic, on the right, among the religious people, they actually became more moderate. They actually became more moderate. They actually became more reasonable. But the left became more fanatical. The left actually became more fanatical. And so whereas before you had this dialectic that kind of reached a certain point, but then, and so when you get this imbalance is unstable. You get, it's like now this table is balanced, but if you remove the balance, the table will fall. And so the academic left, again, compare these two numbers. On the right, the number of people, Christians, let's say, who now respect other religions has gone up. But on the left, the number of people who, let's say, have different views from the extreme left has gone down. So the university has become more extreme, whereas the Christian right became more open. And so you get this imbalance, which finally it explodes. It's like, if there's pressure, it builds and builds, and then it explodes at a certain point. And so that's what you're seeing in the election of someone who obviously was mentally unstable as president. I mean, you think, well, come on, the president of the United States, he can push the button. I mean, whatever your views on abortion or this or that, don't elect someone who's mentally unstable.
But how does he even get in? Like, is there not a criteria?
Because people, I think, look at Germany before World War I. If you look at Germany before World War I, it was the most prosperous, enlightened country. I mean, India is kind of its own category. We won't go there. But if you look at the rest of the world, I mean, Germany in terms of music, you know, the great German composers, the great German scientists, the great German poets. Germany was Berlin before World War I was, you know, a center of vegetarianism. And so what you find is that this very liberal, prosperous country, the real demon in all this is actually Kaiser Wilhelm II. But anyway, that's a whole other story, how he ruined Germany. He actually ruined Germany. But that's a different story. Because he's the one that precipitated World War I. And actually, it was just one war with a halftime show. You know, it was just World War I and then World War II.
Yeah.
And it was really goes back to Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was a moron. And I'll tell you very briefly, in case you're wondering, what actually ruined the 20th century. Kaiser Wilhelm I, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. The first he's kind of a good guy. You know, he was actually, the word Kaiser comes from Caesar, just like the word Tsar comes from Caesar also. So anyway, Wilhelm I was kind of, you know, he was okay. He was okay. He just wanted what's best for Germany. And he had this really, really bright prime minister who was Bismarck. So Bismarck's foreign policy, the center of Bismarck's foreign policy was, first of all, we just want to keep peace because Germany is getting richer and richer. It's, you know, academically, scientifically, culturally, it's on top of the world. And so what we want is just peace. Like rich people don't want social upheaval. And his core strategy, his central strategy to keep Germany at peace was to keep Russia and France against each other. Because he knew the only real threat to Germany, the only two countries that really could be dangerous for Germany are Russia and France. And he knew, and Germany's whole foreign policy was based on the understanding that the worst case scenario, the worst possible thing that could happen to Germany was be caught between Russia and France. And of course, they were worried about France because they had a war over Alsace-Lorraine, you know, and they'd had this war with France and they'd taken a big chunk of France. And the French were like, you know, they were never there, you know, you could go 1,000 years, they wouldn't forget it. They were that, you know, they were never gonna forget that. That's France. And what's that town in France, the Northwest? It's, oh my God, where the EU is.
Lyon.
No, where the EU is. It's like a German accent. Anyway, so therefore, because France didn't like Germany for obvious reasons, because of that war, which was very recent. I mean, that was a war that had just happened. And Russia was rising. Russia was rising and growing. And so the whole foreign policy of Germany was be friendly with France and Russia, be friends with them, and keep them against each other. It was actually a brilliant strategy and it worked.
It blew up in your face.
What happened is Kaiser Wilhelm I died. His son took over, who was a moron. I mean, it's the same reason that Pontius Pilate was sent to be the Roman governor of Israel, because the sons of Herod the Great were morons. But anyway, so Kaiser Wilhelm II was this, he's almost like George W. Bush or something, or he was this young guy who was stupid, you know, spoiled brat, and he thought that Germany needs to have colonies. Germany needs to be, he was frustrated because Germany is so advanced in science, culture, and economically it's the richest country. But look at France and England. They have all these colonies. They have this world position. Germany is the single most important country, but internationally, who cares about Germany? Because we have no colonies. We're not really out there on the world stage. And so therefore, Wilhelm II, he said, we need a Weltpolitik. You understand?
Yeah. Well, dear.
Yeah, Weltpolitik. Germany needs to step out on the world stage. So he fired the cautious Bismarck. Because Bismarck was saying, no, that's really stupid. Your Highness. So he fired Bismarck, and then this moron, Wilhelm II, he proceeded to alienate France and Russia, turn both countries against Germany, and drive them together. And suddenly France and Russia are friends, and they both don't like Germany. It was an absolute disaster. And so therefore, and this was building up, and it kept building up, and therefore, and that led to the fact that, for example, Austria, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they were afraid of what was going on in the Balkan countries, and because the Balkan countries were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and centered in, of course, Vienna, and so therefore the Austro-Hungarian Emperor went to Germany because, look, we're the Germanic people, and you've got to stop the Balkans. And when Berlin decided, yeah, we don't want the Balkans to rebel against our German brothers in Austria, and then Russia said, you can't do that to our Slavic brothers in the Balkans. And then, France is thinking this is a chance to get back Alsace-Lorraine. And so what you have all these interlocking treaties, and it's like the worst case, like, thing where you have, like, you push one little domino, it goes like that. So you have all these interlocking treaties, and so then Germany, anyway, it's actually an interesting story. If you went to a German military college in the run-up to World War I, one of the main subjects you would study is train timetables.
Train?
Yeah. Because with the Industrial Revolution, the train, imagine a few years before, let's say the Germans wanted to send troops to Alsace-Lorraine. It would take days. With a train, it took an hour or two. And so whoever got there first, so there was like extraordinary, really definitive military advantage in getting there first and being able to move your supplies and move your weapons around quickly. And so you would study train timetables. And so Germany had this plan, what to do if we get caught between Russia and France. They had this plan. And so at a certain point, Germany wasn't evil in World War I. We're not talking about Hitler here. And so they, at a certain point, they realized that they could easily be invaded by Russia and France, and they were afraid we may not survive this. We've got to strike first. And then so they couldn't go through Alsace-Lorraine. They couldn't go straight through because after they stole that area from France, just on the French side, the French had spent like 30 or 40 years building up these monster military fortifications so that Germany could never come through there. So they couldn't go that way. And they couldn't go another way because it was a swampy land. So they were forced. The only way they could get to France and do a preemptive strike, it wasn't meant to destroy France, it was like a preemptive strike, a defensive strike, was they had to go through Belgium. And so they asked for permission from Belgium to go through, and Belgium said, no, you can't go through. And so Germany really felt like, we're at risk. We're at serious risk here. We've got to go through Belgium. And so therefore they attacked Belgium. Well, Belgium had a treaty with England, with the United Kingdom. So when Germany forced their way through Belgium, that brought England in. So it was a nightmare. It was like the perfect storm of bad things, and suddenly there was a world war. But it all started with this imbecile Wilhelm II, this spoiled rich kid, who fired a cautious, brilliant minister, Bismarck, and just so really. I blame him. And then after World War I, you get this Treaty of Versailles, and the point is to humiliate Germany and just punish Germany. And so Germany, people were actually starving. Germany became desperate. Again, desperate conditions, desperate solutions, extreme solutions. Yeah. And then you get World War II. So, and it's interesting. It's like they say a butterfly flaps its wings and then you get a hurricane in Miami. And so, yeah, you get this stupid rich kid and then 100 million people died.
So this is going to happen with Trump, do you think?
No, he's actually, when he's like really seriously attacked, he tends to become more moderate. He's, but it's interesting, another way I see Trump, if you look at European history, see, again, you don't hear this in the news. They'll never, you can't get an intelligent explanation of anything. If you look at European history, there was a time in the, let's say, the 19th century, when you had all these nationalist movements. And like, for example, the unification of Germany, the unification of Italy. Because if you study history, as technology advances, it becomes technically possible to have larger political entities in terms of communications, troop movement, economic control, and so greater technology. That's why the Romans, because the Romans were like, they didn't have our technology, but they were really smart. If you read the ancient histories, I mean, these people were really bright. For example, like, again, Tacitus, who's a really interesting historian. I mean, and he was contemporary. He was actually there. The Germans, let's say the Romans were defending their borders with Germany. That's a whole other topic, Germany and Rome. But anyway, so they're defending their borders with Germany. And so the Rhine was a traditional border, the Rhine and then into the Danube. And so the Germans, if you cross the Rhine, it's like, okay, this is war. And usually the Romans would not only chase them back across the Rhine, but they would cross the Rhine and do a punitive thing like, don't even think about crossing the Rhine again. And all this is going on for centuries. So, but the Romans, they were like such engineering monsters. They would come up to this big wide river and literally, and they would cross an entire army with all kinds of, ox carts and cannon. They would actually cross the river like in 24 hours. They would get to a river, there was no bridge. They would build the bridge and they would cross it with an army like in 24 hours.
Wow.
Yeah, so I mean, they were really
edgy, cutting edge on that.
So I forgot what I was going to say. I got so much into the Romans. What was? Oh yeah. So as you have greater technology, you can have larger political entities. The Romans could have such a big empire because if you look at history, someone will conquer a lot of land. They never keep it. They usually can't even hold it for one generation. Usually their children, it's gone. But the Romans, because they were so advanced in technology in terms of bridge building and military technology and communications, and they built roads and so on, therefore you naturally got a larger political entity because it was possible. And so when you get the Industrial Revolution inevitably is going to foster larger political entities because of all the technical advancement. And so therefore you start to get a Germanic state. And people for example, in Prussia or Bavaria, they didn't think they were Germans. They thought they were Bavarians. They thought they were Prussians. And they thought, like, who's a German? Because, they were going back thousands of years, in that particular region, in Italy, the city-state. So you get these national unifications, just like, but what happened is there was also a backlash. I mean, inevitably there's a backlash, like people, so you get regional movements, like, no, we want to secede, we want to just be Bavaria, or in, things like that. So inevitably you get conservative people who fight against this political consolidation and want to go back to the way things were because they're attached to their motherland, which is not Germany, it's Prussia. And so I see Trump like that. I'll give one more example. Inevitably, when history moves forward, you get a backlash. So for example, in 1848, all over Europe, you get these revolutions in 1848. And these are the revolutions that are talked about in Les Miserables. I mean, Les Miserables, there's, a street revolution going on in Paris, and that's not the French Revolution, that's 1848. And so what happened is, with all this, when Napoleon was defeated, they had this Congress of Vienna, and basically the most brilliant conservative minds in Europe met in Vienna to try to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Mm-hmm. Because Napoleon, for all his theatrics, like, putting the crown and stuff, for all his theatrics, Napoleon was actually a constitutionalist. Napoleon actually spread a lot of the French Revolution all over Europe. Because one of the points of the French Revolution, was constitutionalism. That the king, that the leader cannot do whatever they want. Even the leader has to follow the law. That was revolutionary. And so constitutionalism was a leftist revolutionary thing. And Napoleon spread, wherever he went, they established constitutions. So despite his imperial theatrics, in many ways he was actually spreading the principles of the revolution. So when he was defeated, all these great conservative minds met in Vienna, and they said, we have to make the world the way it was. So they restored the Habsburg Empire. They restored the French monarchy. Everywhere Napoleon had gone, they put back the monarchs. But what's interesting is this lasted 28 years. And the reason it only lasted 28 years is because, as Marx said, Marx actually was a good historian, just a terrible prophet. So what Marx said was that the means of production, the economic system, will determine the political and social system. Hunter-gatherers, agrarian revolution, industrial revolution. And so because the industrial revolution had gone too far, and constitutionalism had gone too far, because constitutionalism, in a sense, is like a sister of the industrial revolution. Because if you look at constitutionalism, if you look at the industrial revolution, it's all an attempt to rationalize the world. It goes back to Voltaire and Rousseau and all these people. It's an attempt to come out of a superstitious medieval worldview, come out of fanaticism, and create on earth a rational society. And so there's a rational way to produce product. There's a rational way to produce human needs. You can mass produce human needs so everybody can have a carriage. Before the Industrial Revolution, you had to be rich to have a carriage. But if you can mass produce carriages, everybody gets a carriage. If you can mass produce food, everyone can eat well. And so the Industrial Revolution was actually an attempt to rationalize Europe. And constitutionalism, again, we need a rational constitution, not simply fanatical traditions or whimsical monarchs. And so it's all connected. And so because this rationalizing, which is just the Enlightenment project, what do they call it in French? Illumination? What do they call it? What do they call it? The Enlightenment. Yeah, it was all part of the Enlightenment project, the Industrial Revolution, the French Revolution, the Constitutional Revolution. And so it had gone so far that even though there was a backlash, because you had all these conservatives, and they had money and they had power, and they didn't like the new world that was taking birth. They liked the old world, l'ancien régime. And so therefore, they put it back the way it was. But because the forces of history had gone too far, in 1848 there were revolutions all around Europe, and they just continued to the modern world. And so I see Trump like that, because what you have is this massive globalization, this internationalizing of human life.
So Trump's like a correction.
It's a correction. Trump represents, first of all, Trump, in a sense, I think there's two main historical reasons that a lot of even people who otherwise you might even consider normal human beings voted for him. Because the leftist version is all these crazy white trash, Trump rattled their cage, they woke up and voted for him. And there's some truth in that. But also, a lot of people who actually have college degrees and who in other areas of life appear to be rational human beings actually voted for him. Many of them knowing that he's crazy.
Wow.
Why? Because it's like the lesser of two evils.
Right.
Because many people in America feel that the fanatical, dogmatic, science-denying extreme left actually ultimately was a bigger threat to the country.
Did Hillary Clinton represent that?
Yeah, because Hillary Clinton, just to give one example, which devotees will understand, she came out in favor of late-term abortions. which means that it's actually a child. I mean, it has like a complete human body. It's just waiting to be born, but you can go in and just butcher it or throw acid on it.
That's right.
And by the way, the pro-abortion arguments are logically bad arguments. Forget your moral views; they're just logically bad arguments for various reasons. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, so people like Hillary Clinton were perceived as being in moral freefall.
Yeah.
And like I said, there's massive social science that actually supports certain conservative views, like on sexuality, on the need for a certain minimum amount of social conformity. Not to the extent that you betray your conscience, not to the extent that you vote for Hitler or something, but there's a certain amount of, so infinite diversity actually destroys societies. In other words, there's a certain limit where if you become diverse beyond this, your society basically disintegrates. It collapses. Yeah. So diversity is not an absolute good. It is a good. It's like salt and pepper. In a certain amount, it's good. And more than that, and you can't eat it. You can't eat the food. And so this uncritical, absolutist endorsement of nonconformity to the point of really society unraveling and moral freefall, just having no moral compass, so that the only thing that's truly immoral is to think that something's immoral. It's like the only thing that's immoral is to think that you can judge anything that anyone does. I'll give you an example. Let's say you own some land. You say, this is my land. Let's say a river goes through your land. And, or let's say the person who owns the land above you, and the river goes through that person's land. And that person is dumping toxic substances into the river, which technically is on his land. So that when the water flows down to your land, if your animals drink it, they die. You can't swim in your river. You can't drink water from your river. It's really messing your life up. Yeah. Now, the person upriver says to you, it's my private property. I can do what I want on my private property. But a basic principle of a rational social contract is that if you do something on your property or wherever that is causing serious harm to other people, you can't do it, even on your property. Like you can't, fire a bomb from your property that lands on your neighbor's house. And so the idea is, now take, for example, just an example, which the liberals would they would die if they heard this. But consider the Reproductive Act. Consider the Reproductive Act. We have very substantial social science showing that if people whimsically reproduce and are not good parents, it causes very significant harm to society. It causes significant harm because people who are poorly parented, especially, and the numbers go way up if they're born out of wedlock. And by the way, child abuse is much more common from step parents than from natural parents. So divorce is a great thing. Anyway, so we have reliable social science showing that if children do not grow up in a good home with responsible, mom and dad, that on average, not every case, there are really bad consequences, and society pays the price. Now, the cry of the American Revolution was no taxation without representation. That if you're taxing people, those people have to have a say in policy, right? So if you are engaged in certain behavior, which we know scientifically will harm society, will tax society, that we will all have to pay money and pay taxes for all kinds of social programs for your crazy kids because of the way you raise them. How can you say that society does not have a legitimate interest in regulating those acts? How can society not have a legitimate, rational interest in regulating behavior which harms it? which causes significant damage to society and which harms members of that society. And so on the left, I think, and again, I think what you tend to find is a denial of a lot of social science which shows that a certain amount of freedom, not anti-freedom, but a certain amount of freedom actually is destructive. And even if you want to destroy yourself, be my guest, it's your life. But when you start harming other people, when people are shot dead in the street because you didn't parent your children properly and you produced a monster, and someone's child is killed in the street, or someone's mother or father is killed in the street, and then you have, the far left coming in and saying, everyone is free to do what they want. So if we really want a rational society that's based on facts, based on, what we really know about the world, then yes, there really is climate change. And yes, there really are serious consequences when you give people too much freedom.
So say, for example, gun regulation, that kind of thing would be
Oh my God, yeah, gun regulation. Absolutely. Fortunately, in America now, a majority of people have actually woken up and they realize that this is crazy.
Yeah.
This is crazy. So it is changing, and people are actually, gradually, there's actually a majority of people now that say the way it is now doesn't work. We have to change it. So, but what I'm saying is that in America, there were enough people who believed that this sort of uncritical, uninformed, unscientific libertinism, there's a difference between being liberal and being libertine. That yes, you can kill your own child because if your child is born, you won't be able to buy all the designer clothes you want. That's a good reason to kill your child. Why not? Or if you feel that, well, if my child is born, it might make me unhappy for a little while. Yeah, kill it. Why not? So, frankly, I mean, in America, like in Australia, like everywhere else, there are bogans, as you say, or rednecks, I mean, there are people who are bigoted, who are racist, who are bad people. There are bad people in every country. But the bad people in America could not have elected Trump. Fortunately, there were not enough bad people to elect him, although there were some. But what pushed him over, despite his obvious mental impairment, what pushed him over is the number of people who realize that in some ways is kind of disgusting, but that feared that this libertine, this leftist tyranny in the universities, this libertine policy poses an existential threat to our society.
But didn't Bernie Sanders appear to be more moderate with his dialogue that he was putting on the platform? Didn't that appear, or was that too radical at the time?
To me, Bernie Sanders was just kind of the American version of Francois Hollande. He was just, I saw an interview because I thought I'd give the guy a chance. And, maybe he's better than he sounded. Maybe. But I thought, okay, what do you got to say? So I watched this interview with him. And what I found very interesting is he would not put a number on anything. Like, we're going to raise taxes on the rich. How much? Can't say. We're going to lower taxes on the poor. How much? Can't say. We're going to do this. How much? He wouldn't put a number on anything. And not only that, if you look at his record, he was a person who was almost totally, he was unable, it's like the only bill he ever introduced in Congress in decades that got passed was to build a bridge somewhere, or a post office, I think, and build a post office somewhere in New England. So, in other words, I'm not sure that Bernie Sanders was moderate enough to get the job done, because, as they say, there's a well-known saying: the ideal is the enemy of the real. Or what is it? Now, how does it go? The ideal is the enemy of progress. In other words, what you get ideologues. People are the real world is very complicated.
Yeah.
And so what happens is you get people on the left and the right who are ideological, who reduce artificially. They reduce the complexity of the real world to a few simple slogans. And then people like that because the real world is actually complex. The real world is actually very complicated. And so they reduce it to a few slogans, and then people who don't want to think buy into it. But meanwhile, in Congress, I'm not sure that Sanders, if he would have been elected, you could say better than Trump, but I'm not sure. First of all, I'm not sure he understands how the real world works. I am in favor of medical care. I am in favor of everyone having a right to education on a need basis. Everyone I believe has a right to education. Everyone has a right to the best medical treatment. And also, if you have too great an extreme between rich and poor, it does destabilize the society. It's just like this table. If the legs are too far apart, it falls. So yeah, but I think the way it's like Francois Hollande, the way he wanted to go about that, I don't think he was a deal maker, and you have to be. I don't think he actually. I'm not sure he could work well with people who didn't agree with him. I don't know. And he never gave any practical explanation. He said, for example, we're not going to raise taxes, but we're going to make medical care free and education. Just as France under Hollande, the economy crashed, and you may not like this, but the American economy is booming under Trump. It doesn't mean that Trump is a rational human being. But the point is, the economy is booming.
Well, isn't that also a consequence of Obama's work over that period of time?
I'm not sure that's true. I think the liberal economists say that, not the conservative economists. And so people that live in an echo chamber and surround themselves, let's say, just with people that agree with them. Yeah. But there are many good economists that don't agree with that. And there are some good economists that say that. Obama deserves credit. His foreign policy was catastrophic, as even Hillary Clinton has admitted. But he did get America out of the Great Recession, and you have to give him credit for that. But whether the economy would be booming as it is now is much less clear. So again, I'm not saying that Trump is what we've all been waiting for all our lives.
The only thing is, like with him, like the economy might be booming, but he's certainly creating enemies in other countries by his foreign, his trade embargoes and things like that. So
okay, here's some facts. Again, here's another way of looking at it. And ultimately, I'm not God, I don't know. But here's a way that rational people, some, support some of his policies. The simple fact is that China has been cheating for a long time. And the reason they've been cheating by shamelessly stealing intellectual copyrights. So for example, some company or some government will pay billions of dollars to come up with some new technology and they just steal it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so they've been just shamelessly stealing intellectual property. They have been milking the anti-colonial rhetoric for all it's worth because, okay, we were subjugated, we were a colony, and so, no, now the rules should not be fair for everyone because we have to make up for all the exploitation, oppression. So basically just milking anti-colonial rhetoric so that we can ship all of our products to your country, but you can't ship your products to our country because we have to make up for the imbalance created by colonialism. And so even if you believe that there's some logic in that, it has a shelf life. When China has the second biggest economy in the world, it's not a good argument. And so, yeah, I believe that China has engaged in unfair trade, but basically they've been cheating. And so you may not believe that the solution is to impose tariffs, but some economists think it's a good idea, and some don't. Again, So on that particular issue, we don't have a complete insane monster in the White House. We have a person who, on that issue, is following a certain line of economic thinking endorsed by some educated economists. In the case of North Korea, there's no question that Obama totally failed in trying to stop North Korea from becoming a real menace to the world. Interesting, there's one newspaper in America, I forget which one it was. It USA Today? It's one newspaper which is actually a liberal paper. And on the headline today, they actually said, should Trump get the Nobel Peace Prize?
That's right.
Yeah, and it sounds like that's the craziest question ever asked. But what if it turns out to be the case that by his being just as stupid and abusive as the leader of North Korea, that it actually worked?
That's true.
Yeah, so the point is, there's a reason why, for example, look at the 20th century. Every major American war in the 20th century began under a Democratic president. World War I began under Woodrow Wilson. World War II began under Franklin Roosevelt. The Korean War under Harry Truman. The Vietnam War under John Kennedy. They took over with the French. And of course, then after 9/11, there was a retaliation. But so this is just basic psychology. If there's a bully on your street, and you try to be nice to the bully, you are encouraging the bully. When someone stands up to the bully and punches him in the nose, then there's no more bully. And so, like Obama's idea that let's just be nice to everyone. If we play nice, they will play nice. And it was a catastrophe. So again, and let's look at one more thing. Let's say the Iran policy. Again, I'm not saying that Trump is right. I'm just saying there are educated people who make arguments for the case. The fact is that Iran is engaged in a war against other Muslims, which literally began the day that the Prophet died. Because if you study Islamic history, literally the moment that Muhammad died, there was a battle for power. Within the first 50 years after the death of Muhammad, there were two major civil wars in the Islamic community. Of the first four caliphs were considered the righteous caliphs. They were actually kind of good guys. And so the first four caliphs, first four leaders of the Muslim community, three of them were assassinated by Muslims. So a religion of peace, So the point is that, as we know, Iran Shiite, Middle East mostly Sunni, and so Iran is very actively promoting war and terrorism in the Middle East, very actively. Right now in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, and everywhere. And of course, they're dedicated to the destruction of the state of Israel. So Iran is the biggest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. That's just a fact. And so you can say, should we? And so the geopolitical question here was and also it's a ruthless tyranny, because during Obama's time, there was actually a serious revolution in Iran. And Obama, we want to be nice, we don't want to interfere. And the result, thousands of people were murdered. It is a tyranny. Women are treated terribly. And it's a tyranny, it's a dictatorship. So it's a very pernicious influence. You have a fanatical religious tyranny that thinks they have divine sanction to destroy any country that doesn't believe in their brand of Islam. Ultimately, they can't do it now. But ultimately, if they could, have their wish list, if they could have anything they wanted, they would choose to defeat or destroy any country in the world that doesn't accept their brand, their radical brand of Shiite Islam. And so some people think, well, let's stop their nuclear program and just do that. And then give them all the money they need to sponsor unlimited terrorist programs. And to have enough money in the country so that the people won't resist the dictatorship. Some people feel, and I'm not saying which is right, I'm just saying there's different viewpoints. Some people feel that they really have to be broken because they really are a threat to the world. And
so they're that bully that have,
the bully. Yeah. And there are also people who are convinced, who are not all morons, that any deal with Iran will never really prevent them from covertly continuing a nuclear program. And therefore, you cannot allow them to possibly covertly continue their nuclear program and very actively try to disrupt governments and spread religious fanaticism everywhere they can, including terrorist acts. And so people that believe that, maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. But what I'm saying, it's not a completely insane position.
No.
And again, on all these issues, I'm not saying what's right and wrong. The one thing I know Trump does, I know is absolutely wrong, is this imbecilic policy on the environment. That, there's no question, it's bad, it's evil. But on other foreign policy, and so what you find is, again on the left, that most of the people who criticize Trump are unable to engage in rational analysis. That may turn out that he's wrong. I'm not saying he's right, but at least there's a discussion there. Yeah. And there's a discussion among educated people who have their degrees in economics, who have their degrees in political science. There's something to talk about. It's not just, this is evil, this is crazy. There's actually a discussion there. So I guess all I'm saying really is that we have to return to rational discourse, and we can disagree with each other, but we should
allow for the conversation.
Yeah, allow for reasonable conversation. Yeah. And I don't claim, if I say yay Krishna, I know I'm right because I'm a Gita thumping ISKCON preacher. But on these issues, literally God only knows. So what I'm doing is not saying that definitely, say, Trump or someone else is right, but I think I am successfully problematizing unthinking extreme left positions.
Yeah, I like your thinking. It's very liberal, your thinking. It is.
So, oh my God, I've been going on forever, these poor people.
Excellent.
No wonder no one's listening. So, oh my God, 2 hours? Oh my God.
Did you put money in the meter? Yeah, they put the money in the meter. They put the money in the meter.
I'll have to divide this up and post it, Rule. But I guess, and so, that's why did I join the Hare Krishna movement? Because I am strongly committed to a rational life. And I was presented with a certain philosophy, and which was substantiated by certain, what I consider to be spiritual achievements among the practitioners, like being able to give up certain activities which no sane person would think are healthy.
I love the fact that your philosophy is not extreme at all. Like, it's like, look at both sides and here's a conversation, let's have the conversation. Like, that to me promotes a world that we actually do things in, because without different points of view, you can't build something amazing. Like, it's okay to disagree and take something from that and go, okay, what can I do with that disagreement that actually adds to the topic on hand?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Powerful. It's interesting because in America was founded, by the way, certainly the Massachusetts Bay, and in general by religious fanatics. Religious fanatics. Yeah. Not the founding fathers. You get people like Jefferson. Jefferson was accused of being an atheist. He wasn't, but he was. Jefferson was. No, 2 of the greatest universities in the world were founded by founding fathers. University of Virginia by Jefferson, University of Pennsylvania by Benjamin Franklin, and both of them insisted, like, over my dead body, you're going to make this a Christian university.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the founding fathers were actually much more, a lot of them much more liberal. But if you go back, there was an atmosphere of, certainly in the 17th century, a religious fanaticism. And then it's kind of like it bred this secular fanaticism. This goes back to the whole history of science in Europe. You have to go back to the 1600s, you have to go back earlier, and what you see is that one fanaticism created an opposite fanaticism. So you get fanatical secularism, fanatical leftist secularism, and in America, it's, you get this pendulum thing. But anyway, I think I'll end here. So thank you all very much.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, last question.
What is your purpose in this? Because you bring something really broad.
Okay, my purpose.
Yeah.
I would say my purpose is to try to convince people to give up all forms of fanaticism, including religious. Even with Krishna West, I'm against religious fanaticism in ISKCON. So to give up irrational, fanaticism, by definition irrational, so that we can be open to a completely reasonable understanding of God, a reasonable way of teaching that to other people. And if we get trapped, if we get seduced by political fanaticism, we will actually not be able, it really compromises our ability to have rational lives as human beings. And so if someone is supposed to be a spiritual teacher, but gets suckered by or gets dragged into some type of extremist political ideology, then it really destroys your ability, first of all, to yourself have a completely reasonable human life.
Yeah,
and also it prevents you from really convincing other people to be reasonable. And so whether it's religious extremism, including Hare Krishna religious extremism, or political extremism, I just believe that we should be reasonable and just try to figure out a moderate, balanced position, because there are different kinds of people, and as soon as you go to one extreme, all you are is pulling back the pendulum. And this is not rocket science, what happens next. And so the center is the most stable point. Because if you actually find a balanced, moderate position, it's stable, it's actually sustainable. Extremes are not sustainable because they create their own contradiction. Hey, I almost sound like that almost sounds like a Monty Python movie. Okay. Thank you all very much. That went on for a while, didn't it?
No, it's very incredibly interesting.